Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I wanted to introduce you to another technique regarding panning and the stereo image. And this technique is to keep your bass mono. So if you think about how a mono sound plays on a stereo system, you will find that the same exact waveform will be coming out of both speakers at the same time. And you can imagine that this will result in a more powerful sound than two different waveforms coming through the speakers, as you would have in a stereo sound. In electronic dance music especially, you want a very powerful bass, and keeping your bass mono because of this can help add to its power. It also helps ensure good playback because many systems merge the bass to mono anyway in order to play it through a subwoofer. And mixing your bass to be mono and mixing it as a mono sound will help ensure that it will play back well on a number of different sound systems. Now, a lot of people will teach you or tell you this technique as if it's an absolute rule. They will tell you no matter what, you have to mono your bass. And if you don't mono your bass, your mix is bad or your mix is muddy. But this is definitely not the case. Usually you'll want your main bass mostly mono, if not 100% mono. But for other sounds, or even your main bass in certain genres, some stereo width in the bass is desired. So reverb kicks are one example of a sound that I wouldn't want to be mono. And I actually like them to have a pretty decent stereo width. With reverb kicks, I want a huge sound that surrounds the listener, and making them mono would really take away from this effect. It won't matter very much on a sound system with a subwoofer, but in headphones, many different kinds of car sound systems, and any other sound system that doesn't merge the bass to mono, the difference will be very noticeable. And so you can hear this with this example. It sounds very big and very full. It's distorted, but that's part of the sound. And you can hear if I merge this to mono. It's just going to lose a lot of its hugeness to that sound. And like I said before, you won't notice the difference as much if you have a subwoofer, but if you are listening on a completely stereo system, you will hear that. It sounds a lot more lame, kind of, without that stereo width. And another example of a bass sound that you might want to keep some stereo width in is a narrow bass, especially in chill tracks. You want to submerge the listener in a huge bass that surrounds them for those kind of tracks, and some amount of stereo in the bass will add to that effect. So while it is a good guideline to mix your bass to be mono, it's definitely not a rule, and stereo width in the bass can be desirable in some cases. So here's one example of a bass of mine that is partly stereo, partly not. So there are two layers to it. There's the upper bass layer, which you can hear is a lot of the high-end sound, some mid-range, and then it also does have a decent presence in the bass. And the other layer is just a completely centered mono sub-layer. And the sub-layer plays only the fundamental, where the higher bass layer plays the fundamental a tiny bit, but it's hardly even, recognizable. But it plays the second harmonic pretty well, and then, all of the mid-range and high-end. And so when you play them together, it keeps some amount of stereo width in the bass and across the whole frequency range, but it does still have that really solid mono bass. And, I quite like this bass. A few people have given me compliments on it, which is pretty cool. And, it's a result of me not using a completely mono bass. And then another example, just so you can know that I'm not just, making this up, is here's a professional track with some stereo width in the bass. And this is by Edit, and I really like the mixes of Edit's tracks on this album. And I will show you, and you'll be able to hear that the bass isn't very mono. But the mix still sounds great in my opinion. And so you can see if I solo the bass, if I filter out all the high frequencies, you'll be able to see on the vector scope that there's a good amount of stereo width to that bass, where most people will tell you that your bass has to be mono. It's not super wide, but there are tracks on this same album where the kick, I know one track, I can't think of the name of it at the moment, but the kick is very wide in the bass. So, this is a good piece of advice and it can be useful, but sometimes some amount of stereo width can be desirable in your bass. And so, it's really up to you to decide whether you want your bass to be completely mono or mostly mono or, more wide or anything like that. Don't let people tell you that your bass has to be mono and just take it as a rule because, it's just a tip, it's a technique, it's a piece of advice that can be very helpful in certain genres of music and is less helpful in other genres of music. So you can hear this is kind of a glitch hop type track. And the bass does have some stereo width to it, but in trap music, for example, the 808s, you probably wouldn't want any stereo width to an 808. It would just kind of sound weird, and it would also make the 808 lose power whenever it were to be converted to mono. But at the same time, if you're being experimental and you kind of know what you're doing a little bit, then why not, Why not have some stereo in your 808, whether it's caused by reverb or whatever? You just would want to make sure that you have a decent mono compatibility in that bass, if you were to do something kind of creative like that.